Okay, my name is Howard Eber and I am an alcoholic. Welcome everyone to week number 5 of the 5th cycle on Zoom. I think we're about 13 or 14 years of continuous Sunday night workshops. But thank you all for coming. Appreciate your support. We're about to begin the doctor's opinion. We spoke over the past few weeks about how this thing of ours got started and who some of these people are who started it. And it seemed that a discussion always starts with the Oxford group. And what I tried to do is push it back a little further and let's start before the Oxford group. And so what I want to do is the same thing today, which is if we're going to talk about the doctor's opinion and why it was so controversial, it might be helpful to know about the doctors that came before him that also had similar ideas. Throughout the reading of Doctor's Opinion, I'm going to be reading parts where Dr. Silkworth refers to certain other physicians as we. And the one I interpret that as being those who are like-minded, those others who have espoused the same kind of beliefs as he has, most of whom are long since passed. But he puts himself in this category with these innovative doctors. And I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes and talk about who they are. Andy, if you'll give me handout number 1. We're going to start with Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush was actually a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Goes that far back. He wrote an article, and you see a copy of it there, Ardent Spirits, and he wrote it on alcoholism and suggested that it might be a disease, that it was not a question of just weakness, that it might be a disease, that it might be considered a chronic illness, and one that got progressively worse as the person got older. That was pretty early on. This was in 1746 is when he was born. So it's this is significant. And then we have the next page is Dr. Thomas Trotter. Dr. Thomas Trotter, who lived from 1760 to 1832, was a naval physician. And he wrote an essay called Essay on Drunkenness, which you see pictured above. And it was the first ever book-length consideration of alcohol dependence and its treatment. And it referred to alcohol consumption as a disease of the mind. So it's one of the first times that we refer to it as a disease, that it's not just a question of morality, it's a disease. And then a few years later, next page, we have Magnus Huss. Magnus Huss lived from 1807 to 1890, a Swedish physician and professor. He was known for, he's come to be known as the first doctor who actually coined the term alcoholism. In 1849, he referred to the pathological changes in the body due to long-term alcohol intoxication. That's how he defined alcoholism. He was described as the father of Swedish and forefather of Swedish and the founder of clinical education in Sweden. And then we have, last but not least, at least that I know of at this moment, Dr. Alexander Lambert was President Roosevelt's personal physician. He came up with a cure, what he thought was a cure, what the Towns Hospital used as the Lambert Towns method of cure, which had to do with belladonna treatments, and we'll be getting into some of that later. It is noteworthy that you'll see in a lot of places that the Towns-Lambert-Belladonna treatment was incorrectly attributed to a Dr. Sam Lambert, not Alexander Lambert. They were brothers, but it was Alexander Lambert who worked with Charles Towns on the treatment, not his brother Sam. So if you see Sam Lambert refer to alcoholism treatment, we're talking about Dr. Alexander Lambert. So those are some of the people who came before Dr. Silkworth. Let me give you some background on Dr. Silkworth here. Dr. Silkworth was a neurologist. He lost everything in the stock market crash of 1929. His friend Charlie Towns, who was the director of the Charles Towns Hospital for Alcoholism and Drug Addiction, asked him to come and work with him. That Dr. Silkworth had done some work as an intern and in Bellevue Hospital with alcoholics, and felt that he'd be a good match for the hospital. Plus, he needed a job. So he gave him a job. He put him to work as a director, clinical director of the Towns Hospital. And he started to notice between 1930, which is roughly when he started to work there, and 1938, 39, when he wrote the doctor's opinion, he worked with approximately 40,000 alcoholics. And he began to see that there's something different about this group of drinkers, that they come into the hospital in terrible, horrible physical and mental condition. And he gets them cleaned up and he gets them back into health. And it often takes weeks or months, and it was not inexpensive. This was a very expensive process. And these guys would get all healthy, and Towns would release them. And then a couple of days, weeks, months, they'd come back in worse condition than they were ever in. And then they would get them healthy again and send them on their way. And then they'd come back again and again and again. And then Dr. Silkworth noticed that there's this other group of alcoholics who tend to come in just as bad as that first group. But for whatever reason, they have been presented with something in their life that kind of scared them straight, and they never came back in. They never came back in for treatment. They never relapsed, at least according to him. And then there's this third group who never wind up in the hospital as a result of their drinking. So he started to think that there's something different about this first group, that there's actually something physiologically about the way their body, they consume alcohol that sets them apart, that they actually have a kind of an allergic reaction. And we're going to talk about that word quite a bit in this chapter. An allergy is defined as a body's abnormal reaction to any food, substance, or chemical. And he says that these people have an actual allergic reaction that once they start drinking, they cannot stop. And he said that the real problem is not the alcoholic's body's reaction. The real problem is the alcoholic's mental problem, which is after a while of abstinence, his brain begins to play tricks on him. His brain begins to remind him of all the things that alcohol did for him and none of the things that it did to him. And while initially they can push aside all of the knowledge of what's going to happen when I start this drinking, they eventually give in to that obsession, and they basically convince themselves that it won't happen this time, take that drink, trigger the allergy, and they're off to the races. And this is the background of Dr. Silkworth. But I want to also give you a little bit of insight into, there's a book that you may want to pick up called Dr. Silkworth, The Little Doctor Who Loved Drunks. And I'm going to read to you a couple of things that were from this book, that were from writings about this book. It's in your handout material. Andy, if you'll just put up number 2. I'm not going to read it all, but we're going to bounce through a few things to kind of give you an idea of why Dr. Silkworth was so significant, why this doctor had to be in the position that he was in. Bill Wilson called this the chain of cosmic coincidences, that if one thing didn't happen the way it did, we wouldn't be here today. If Dr. Silkworth wasn't the doctor on call at a particular time at that hospital, we may not be here today. So here's a description of a scene. A drunk is lying on a bed in a hospital, and a doctor is sitting beside the bed. The drunk is talking earnestly to the doctor, and he says, "A wave of depression came over me," the drunk is saying. "I realized I was powerless, hopeless. I couldn't help myself, and that nobody else could help me. I was in black despair, and in the midst of this, I remembered about this God business. And I rose up in bed and said, if there be a God, let him show himself now." Now, in most cases, doctors who treat alcoholics are pretty used to hearing some pretty crazy stories. So he's probably thinking, maybe a little bit skeptical at this point, and thinking he's probably just detoxing. But he goes on to say, all of a sudden there was a light. The drunk goes on to say, a blinding white light that filled the whole room. A tremendous wind seemed to be blowing all around me and through me. I felt as if I were standing on a high mountaintop. Now, the doctor's probably thinking, this guy's tripping, that this guy is just out of his head. He's out of his nut, that we're just going to snow him. And when doctors say we're going to snow him, that means they give him a lot of tranquilizers and put him out for a while, that this guy's just off his nut. But he didn't do that. He didn't do that. The drunk continued. He said, I felt that I stood in the presence of God. I felt an immense joy, and I was sure beyond all doubt that I was free from my obsession with alcohol. The only condition was I share this secret of this freedom with other alcoholics and help them to recover. The drunk paused and turned to the doctor and said, ever since it happened, I've been laying here wondering whether or not I'd lost my mind. So tell me, doctor, am I insane or not? That drunk was Bill Wilson. And fortunately for Bill Wilson and for AA, fortunately for thousands of us who have come afterwards, the doctor who was sitting there talking to him was Dr. William D. Silkworth. By great good luck or by the grace of God, depending upon your viewpoint, the doctor was Dr. Silkworth. It would have been so easy to dismiss Bill's experience as a hallucination, one of the many possible vagaries of a rum-soaked brain, and a disparaging word from the doctor right at this point could have choked off the tender shot of faith and killed it. Alcoholics Anonymous might not have started elsewhere, may have started elsewhere somehow, or it might not. Certainly, it would not have started there. Very possibly, the life of every one of us hung in the doctor's answer to that question. Am I insane? It was there that Dr. Silkworth made the first of his indispensable contributions to AA. He knew by an insight that no amount of medical training alone could give a man that what happened to Bill was real and important. I don't know what you got, he said, he told Bill, but whatever it is, hang on to it. You're not insane. You may have the answer to your problem. The encouragement of the man of science, as much as the spiritual experience itself, started AA on its way. When Dr. Silkworth died of a heart attack in his home in New York early in the morning of March 22nd, even those AAs who knew him best and loved him most awoke to the realization that we had lost a great friend. a great doctor, a greater man than we'd ever realized. It was particularly hard to appreciate the greatness of the man while Dr. Silkworth was yet with us because of his profound personal modesty and the disarming gentleness, the unassuming and almost invisible skill with which he accomplished his daily miracle of medical and spiritual healing. We know he was a prodigious and relentless worker, but still it was a shock to discover that in his lifetime of work with those who suffer our disease, he talked with 51,000 alcoholics, 45,000 in towns, 6,000 at Knickerbocker Hospital. And we'll get to that in a minute. And this little gentle doctor with white hair and his china blue eyes, his child's eyes, saint's eyes, was a man of immense personal courage. It must be remembered that he went much further than merely encouraging Bill's faith in his spiritual experience. He saw to it that Bill was permitted to come back into Towns Hospital to share his discovery with other alcoholics. Today, when carrying the message to others has become a very respectable part of our undeniably effective program, it is easy to forget that carrying the message in the beginning was a highly unorthodox undertaking. It had no precedent, no history of success. Most authorities would have turned thumbs down, just being plain screwball. Dr. Silkworth had his professional reputation to lose and nothing whatsoever to gain by permitting and encouraging this unheard of procedure of one God-bitten drunk trying to pass on his strange story of a light and a vision to other alcoholics, most of whom at the time received it with lively hostility or magnificent indifference. Dr. Silkworth from the beginning threw all of his weight as a doctor, a neurologist, a specialist in alcoholism into aiding the progress of this mongrel and highly unpedigreed society in every possible way. He committed social and professional heresy right and left in order to publish and implement his burning faith in a movement which as yet only half suspected its own destiny and which had to grope rather blindly to find terms for its faith in itself. When there was need for money to publish the AA book, Dr. Silkworth used his influence to help Stent to raise the money to publish the book. I'm not going to read all this. I'm just going to jump to the bottom. It's estimated that the percentage of real recoveries coming from alcoholics that Dr. Silkworth worked with when he was at Bellevue was about 2%. The large number of hopeless cases, the deep degrees of human tragedy and suffering involved, weighed heavily upon the doctor. He was often profoundly discouraged. Then came Bill W. One who has known the doctor intimately over many years has said this about it. Silky never told me this. It's my own opinion, but I believe that AA was Silky's reward. All those years he plodded along, treating drunks medically, defending them, loving them, and not getting anywhere much. And then God said, "All right, little man, I'm going to give you and your drunks a lift." And when the lightning struck, there was Silky, right where he belonged, right in the midst of it. That's who we're talking about. That's who we're talking about, who wrote this chapter. I should tell you that when the book was being written, Dr. Silkworth agreed to write this as an introduction with two provisions. First provision is you call it an opinion. I don't have any scientific data. I only have my experience and my observations, and this is my opinion. The alcohol theory, the mental obsession, the spiritual malady, these are my opinions. So you can't present it as anything other than opinion. And the second request, said, Bill, you cannot put my name on this. 2 years prior to this book being published, he wrote an article in the Lancet Journal, which we'll talk about hopefully today, where he expressed his feelings and his opinions, and he got torn apart. He got lambasted. They said that he was buying into the nonsense that all these alcoholics were throwing at him over the years, and he was even losing it. Now, that was in 1939. By the time the second edition was published in 1955, his name did appear in the book, but in 1951, Dr. Silkworth passed away. So Bill, with the approval of Silkworth's family, put his name in the book, which is why you'll see it in the second, third, and fourth edition. But if you have a reprint of the first edition, it just says Dr. Dash, Dash, Dash. It does not have his name in it. So let's get started. Now that we have some background into all of this, we're on doctor's opinion, and hopefully if you've got your study version, you can take plenty of notes. Dr. Silkworth, if you want some biographical data here, was born July 27th, 722, 1873. July 22nd, 1873. Sorry. He passed away, as I said, March 22nd, 1951, at the age of 78. He was a neurologist, excuse me, who was director of alcoholic treatment at Towns Hospital and later at the Knickerbocker Hospital in Manhattan. Uptown, it was not as fancy a hospital as Towns was. It was more for everyday people. But that's who Dr. Silkworth is. Dr. Silkworth is the doctor we're talking about in the doctor's opinion. Excuse me. We of Alcoholics Anonymous believe that the reader will be interested in the medical estimate of the, please highlight this, plan of recovery described in this book. I'm going to pose a question before we even get too far into it. Is the plan of recovery that he's talking about here, is he referring to the fellowship? Or is he referring to the book? We don't have to look any further than the end of the first sentence to answer that question. He says that the plan of recovery is what's the medical estimate of the plan of recovery described in this book. He doesn't describe the fellowship in this book. He describes the plan of action. Convincing testimony must, and we highlight all of the musts in green. There are a great many for people who say there are no musts in AA. We have an ongoing list. I believe we're up to 139 of them right now. If you want a copy of that list, just send me a request to that email address, and I will send you that. But we're going to highlight them all as we go along in green. So, convincing testimony must surely come from medical men who have experience with the sufferings of our members and have witnessed our return to health. A well-known doctor, chief physician at a nationally prominent hospital specializing in alcoholic and drug addiction. So we're not supposed to talk about drugs. First page. A great many things are going to get blown up. A great many myths are getting blown up as we go through this. Drug addiction gave Alcoholics Anonymous this letter. Now, what I just read to you was written by Bill Wilson. And it was written as a way to introduce the good doctor. It was initially intended to kind of lend some credibility to the book itself, that it's not just written by a bunch of alcoholics, that here's a medical person with extensive background who's writing this. So basically, in the first paragraph, Bill introduces Dr. Silkworth, and he says the following. He says, you can pay attention to what he has to say. How does he say it? Because he says he has specialized in treating all of these alcoholics and addicts over the years. So he's saying, listen to what this guy has to say. Now watch Bill Wilson's sense of humor. This is the letter that Dr. Silkworth wrote. There's a copy of it in the emails I sent out to you. It is exactly as it appears on this page, except on the copy that you have is the original, and it mentions Bill Wilson by name. The letter says, and incidentally, the letter is not dated in the book. I don't know why, but if you'd like to put it in, the date of the letter was July 27, 1938. The copy that I sent you in the emails is dated. It says July 27th, July 27, 1938. The letter says, I have specialized in the treatment of alcoholism for many years. Like we said, about 40,000 people in this time. In late 1934, I attended a patient, and in your letter, the original, it says, named Bill Wilson, who, though he had been a competent businessman of great earning capacity, was an alcoholic of a type I'd come to regard as hopeless. Please highlight hopeless. And basically, he's talking about alcoholics who have no expectation of a cure, that they don't expect anything to happen, that they're clinging to that last thread. And we all know what that's like. So he's regarded as of the hopeless variety. In the course of his third treatment, please underline third treatment, Bill Wilson was in Pounds Hospital 4 times. There are 4 documentations of that in Lois's book, in other books that Bill wrote, at Stepping Stones, Bill's home in Katona, New York. There are several admission slips that mention that. And I say that because I've heard people speaking saying, well, we don't know how many times he was there. Well, we have records of 4 times. The hospitals kept records. We know he was there 4 times, and everybody around Bill who wrote a book mentioned the same thing. They're all in agreement. 4 times. So in the course of his third treatment, which means between the third and the 4th treatment, something happened. And let me give you the dates for the treatments. The first date of treatment, and we're going to come across this in Bill's story, happened in the summer of 1933. Summer 33. The second visit took a year. Was the summer of 34. The third visit happened late summer, early fall 1934. So somewhere between that visit and this last visit, which we haven't mentioned yet, which is December of 1934, somewhere between the 3rd and the 4th visit, something happened. It says he acquired certain ideas concerning a possible means of recovery. Now, what that means is Dr. Silkworth was treating Bill, obviously the first 3 times he was in the hospital. Dr. Silkworth gave him his prognosis. He told him what was wrong with him. He told him about the allergy and the obsession, but he didn't have an answer for how to treat that. And somewhere between the 3rd and the 4th visit, Bill met with a friend of his who was the worst alcoholic Bill ever met. Bill said, if I ever got to be as bad as Ebbie Thatcher, I'd have to quit drinking. I just couldn't go on living if I was that bad. This guy, Ebbie Thatcher, showed up and said, Bill, I'm 3 months sober. I haven't had a drink in 3 months, and it's because I got involved with this first century fellowship called the Oxford Groups, who had certain specific spiritual activities that would result in my being absolutely pure, absolutely honest, absolutely unselfish, and absolutely loving. And if I used their activities, which had to do with restitution, it had to do with amends, it had to do with sharing of wrongs, it had to do with helping of others, and we'll get into all of those specifics later. He said, as a result of those things, I was lifted of the obsession to drink. And look at me, Bill. Bill noticed it as soon as Ebbie walked into his house. He was freshly, you'll see it when we get to Bill's story, that his clothes were pressed. There was something different about his eyes. There was a glimmer in his eyes. The eyes, what is it? The eyes are the something of the soul.
Window.
Sorry?
Window.
Window. Thank you.
Windows of the world.
Eyes are the window of the soul. Absolutely. So there was something about Bill's eyes when Ebbie called on him. But that's what we're talking about here, that he had learned something about a recovery program. So for the first time, we know that there's one person who had the definition of the problem in his mind from Dr. Silkworth, and he now has the definition of the solution in his mind from Ebbie Thatcher and the Oxford Groups. So for the first time, both came together in the mind of one person, and that person is Bill Wilson. And that's what we're talking about here. That he was, in the course of the third treatment, he acquired certain ideas about possible means of recovery. And please highlight the rest of this paragraph. And I'm even going to suggest you underline the first 5 words, as part of his rehabilitation. So as part of his treatment, he commenced to present his conceptions to other alcoholics. And let's underline, present his conceptions to other alcoholics, impressing upon them that they must, oops, there's another must, do likewise with still others. This has become the basis of a rapidly growing fellowship of these men and their families. And please underline this. This man and over 100 others appear to have recovered. Once more, we're being reintroduced to a word that was presented on the very first page of this book, recovered. You want to say I'm a recovered alcoholic at a meeting, go right ahead and say it. As long as you understand the way in which it's used in this book. Bill defines it, we already saw that in the forewords and the preface, as recovered from a hopeless state of mind and body. The symptoms of our disease, the active disease, the symptoms are no longer present. We're not drinking. We're not a source of chaos and confusion to everybody around us. We're productive members of society. Those conditions, those symptoms are no longer present. We have recovered from that. So he's saying, and please, next to the section we just underlined, the fact this man and over 100 others appear to have recovered. Next to that, please write fact number 1. This is fact number 1. I personally know scores of cases who are of the type with whom, please underline and highlight, other methods had failed completely. And next to that, write fact number 2. So we have 2 facts here. Again, this is a man of science. So he's going to give us specifics. He's going to give us data. Here are 2 facts. That this guy is among 100 others who have recovered. They appear to have recovered. They're not drinking anymore. They're leading productive lives. And the second fact is that all other methods failed completely. He didn't just say failed, he said failed completely. Everything they tried, any possible way, failed. And we all know what that's like. Bill called AA the court of... I'm sorry, I was just muted. I don't know how long I've been muted, but Bill called this the court of last resort. This is the last door on the last house of the last street. It is the last thing we tried. And for me, the last thing I tried was the first thing that worked. So we have these facts. Continuing, he says, these facts, what we just read, A and B, fact 1 and 2 rather, appear to be of extreme medical importance because of the, and please highlight and underline, the extraordinary possibilities of rapid growth. The extraordinary possibilities of rapid growth in this group, they may mark a new epoch. An epoch just means a new era, a new age. That's all epoch means, an age or an era. This may mark a new age in the annals of alcoholism. Annals just means history. So he's saying that these two facts present an incredibly important answer in this incredibly destructive problem, that they may very well have come up with the solution. And he says, these men may well have a remedy for thousands of such situations. And I suggest that above thousands, we write millions. Millions. I don't think we are thousands. We are in the millions. And please highlight the next sentence in pink. We highlight in pink for prayers and promises. And this is a promise. This is a promise from Dr. Silkworth. And what Dr. Silkworth promises us is the following. He says, you may rely absolutely on anything they say about themselves. Now, here's where Bill's playfulness comes into effect. He introduces us in the first paragraph. He said, the guy I'm going to introduce you to knows what he's talking about. So pay attention to what he's talking about. And Dr. Silkworth starts talking. And what does he say? Pay attention to Bill. He knows what he's talking about. Bill has a unique sense of humor. He really does. But be that as it may, this line we just read, I have heard used the wrong way so many times. I've heard people use this line that you may rely absolutely on what they say about themselves to refer to what is heard at meetings. At meetings. That's not an accurate statement. What this means is you can rely on what they say about themselves in this book. What you hear at meetings is not the same thing as what you hear in these books, and we all know that. I've spent hours doing presentations about that ain't in the big book, about all of the things we hear at meetings that are not in the big book. So please don't apply this promise to meetings, to what you hear at meetings. What you hear at meetings can contain truth, but you can't rely absolutely on it. You can rely absolutely on everything that this book contains. Very truly yours, William D. Silkworth, MD. And as I said in the first edition, that was just --MD. Now we have what I consider the connective tissue. It is written by Bill Wilson to connect us from the first letter we just read to the next part of Dr. Silkworth's contribution, which is referred to erroneously as the second letter. It's not a letter, it's a statement. This second part that we're about to read in a moment or so is not a letter, it's a statement. And how do I know that? Just follow me for a minute, you'll see. The physician who, at our request, gave us this letter is what we just read, has been kind enough to enlarge upon his views in another statement, which follows. Please underline statement. And please highlight the next sentence. Excuse me. In this statement, that underlined statement 2, he confirms what we who have suffered alcoholic torture must believe. Is another must. They're starting to pile up, aren't they? We're only on the second page. Must believe that, and you may want to underline this phrase, that the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind. Up until this time, it was thought all to be in the mind. It was a question of willpower. It was a moral dilemma. We now know that it also involves our body's abnormal reaction to the ingestion of these chemicals. Except for some of those doctors we talked about before, and Dr. Silkworth's going to refer to them soon. That's what everybody thought. It was a question of willpower. Continuing, he says, it did not satisfy us to be told that we could not control our drinking just because, 1, we were maladjusted to life. 2, we were in full flight from reality. Or 3, were outright mental defectives. Now, I don't know about anybody else here, but I was never much good at gambling, but I hit a trifecta here. I caught all 3 of these here. I hit on all 3. I was in full flight from reality. I was maladjusted to life, and I was an outright mental defective. These things were true to some extent, in fact, to a considerable extent, with some of us. Please highlight the next 3 lines. But we are sure that our bodies were sickened as well. Please underline, bodies are sickened as well. This is the first mention of alcoholism as a sickness. It is not referred to as a condition. It is referred to as an illness, a malady. That our bodies were sickened as well. In our belief, any picture of the alcoholic which leaves out this physical factor is incomplete. Let's underline leaves out this physical factor is incomplete. The doctor's theory that, and please highlight and underline these words, we have an allergy to alcohol, interests us. Now, I don't know about anyone else, but when I first came in to recovery, and people referred to being allergic to alcohol and drugs, they were joking. They would say things like, I can't drink a drug because I break out. I break out in handcuffs. I break out in the back of police cars. I break out doors. I break out windows. I break out in car accidents. Ha, 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 ha. But when I read it in this book, I thought, my God, they're serious about this shit. How can I possibly be allergic to something I consume in such large quantities? I'm allergic to ragweed and pollen and cat dander. And if I'm exposed to just the slightest amount of it, I have an immediate physiological reaction. I sneeze, I sniffle, I wheeze, I tear. I'm sure that there's 160, 170 people here today. I'll bet at least half or more have allergies of one kind or another. If you're allergic to strawberries and you eat one, not a bowl full, you eat one, you have an immediate physiological reaction. You break out in hives. If you're allergic to peanuts and peanut oil, and you eat something that's cooked with peanut oil, your tongue could swell up, block you from breathing, and you could die. And I never had any of those reactions to alcohol or drugs. So what kind of nonsense is calling it an allergy? It just doesn't add up. Well, thank God Charlie Parmley, who was my big book mentor at the time, taught me that when I was in doubt, look up words in the dictionary. And when I looked up allergy in the dictionary, this is what I found. And you may want to write it down. If you have the study version, let's write it in the opposite page. If you don't, put it in the bottom of the page, top of the page. But an allergy is defined as an abnormal reaction to the ingestion of any food, beverage, or substance. An abnormal reaction. What is that? Abnormal is not normal, not regular. It's not typical. It's not your average reaction. Most people have some drinks, a few lines of what's going around, a few hits on whatever it is, and you offer them more, and at some point they're going to say, no, thank you. Either they're going to say, if I do any more, I'm going to get sick, or I got to drive, so I got to be careful. Or they say some very, very strange words, things like, I'm right where I want to be. I don't need any more. Well, I don't know about anyone else, but I always drank or drug with the expectation of arriving right where I want to be if I just had one more. And it's just one more, and it just one more. So if the normal reaction to the ingestion of these chemicals is to at some point, for some reason, say no, and I am unable to do that, then my reaction, my abnormal reaction, my allergic reaction is the inability to say no. That once I put one in me, all I want is that second. And the second calls out for the third. The third pleads for the fourth begs for the fifth, and by the time I get to that 10th or 15th drink, I want that 16th drink more than anything I have ever wanted at any time in my life. And it only gets progressive from there. That's an abnormal reaction. So once I could absorb that, I was ready to believe what I was being told here. When I was first exposed to it, I just, this is nonsense. But when I studied it and found out what the words mean, I believed it wholeheartedly, because it really describes my reaction to the ingestion of these chemicals. So we have an allergy to alcohol interests us. As laymen, our opinion as to its soundness may, of course, mean little. But as ex-problem drinkers, and let's highlight that in orange, we're going to highlight recovered references to in orange. And that's a recovered reference. Ex-problem drinkers means you've recovered. So far we've had a few uses of the word recovered. Highlight them all in orange. And again, one of the reasons why this may seem silly, but one of the reasons I find it useful to highlight by color is if I want to find all of the promises or all of the musts or all of the referred references in a book, all I've got to do is thumb through the pages and I could see it by the color. So it helps me to identify those things. That's all, just a personal thing. But as ex-problem drinkers, we can say that his explanation makes good sense. It explains many things for which we cannot otherwise account. Please highlight that last sentence. Boy, is that true for me. You may even want to underline that, because it was a relief for me to know that I wasn't a weak person. I wasn't a morally corrupt person. I wasn't a bad person. I wasn't what everybody around me was always telling me and calling me and accusing me of being. I wasn't any of those things. It was a relief because it explains so many things for which I could not otherwise account. Anything else in my life, I set my mind to it, chances are I was able to accomplish it. Why is it this one thing, the most destructive thing in my life? I tried and tried and tried and could not, no matter what process, no matter what book, no matter what exercise, no matter what treatment, I could not get control. So it explains much for which I couldn't otherwise explain. Though we work out our solution on the spiritual as well as the altruistic plane. Let's highlight that phrase. We work out our solution on the spiritual as well as the altruistic plane. We favor hospitalization for the alcoholic who's very jittery or befogged. Let's talk a little bit about those two words that Bill uses. He says we work out our problem on the spiritual plane, which refers to this search, this journey that we are going to be on to seek this power greater than ourselves that is able to accomplish for us what we could never accomplish on our own. That's the spiritual part of the program, this quest, this journey that we are on and will always be on, as well as the altruistic plane. And the altruistic just means selfish, selfless, opposite of selfish. So we're working out this spiritual solution for our lives as we are working with others. We're not doing one and then the other. It's both. And he says we favor hospitalization for the alcoholic who's very jittery or befogged. If the guy is in those first hours of detoxification, it's very hard to focus. It was for me. I'm not one of those people who was able to stop drinking or drugging, and then that was it. I had to be in treatment. I had to be removed from that environment. I had to be protected. I had to be in a place where I was not expected to be a son, a father, an employee, an employer, nothing. I could just be an alcoholic in need of help. So I needed to get befogged before I could hear any message that was being presented. And he says, more often than not, it is imperative. You know what imperative means? Must. So let's highlight that in green. It's a $50 version of the word must, imperative, that a man's brain be cleared before he is approached. And here's the first reference to approach in this book. We highlight approach references in blue because somehow in today's culture, it has become acceptable to take the attitude of, I'll be approached by the person who needs help. to be available to the person who needs help. Well, there's nowhere in this book that is indicated. Quite to the contrary. Bill tells us over and over and over again, it is our job, our responsibility to approach the person who's new, the person who's struggling, the person who's suffering. Not to take the attitude of, well, if he wants my help, he'll ask for it, or he's just not ready yet. Nonsense. It is our job to approach that person. And Bill says it over and over again. And here's the first reference to it. That his mind's brain be cleared before he is approached, as he has then a better chance of understanding and accepting what we have to offer. You may want to highlight understanding and accepting what we have to offer, because what that is the solution. What we have to offer is this solution. Now, this part that we're about to read, and we'll probably get into it next week, this is the so-called second letter, the statement that was written. Now, this statement was based on an article that Dr. Silkworth wrote in 1937, before the book was published, 2 years before it was published. He published this article in the Lancet Journal, a British medical publication, one of the most respected, as I understand, one of the most respected medical journals still to this day. And he wrote an article in the Lancet Journal called The Reclamation of the Alcoholic. It's in your emails. I sent you all a copy of it. It's all very scientific. It's a little bit complicated. It makes my hair hurt to read some of it. But the article is for doctors. It's for physicians. It's not for the layman. It's not for us to understand. So it speaks to the doctor on the level that they're at. So when Dr. Silkworth was asked to take that letter and rewrite it for the book, he rewrote it. And you also have a copy of that. I think that was called, in the emails I sent you, it was, well, I'll think of it in a moment here. I'm sorry. It was called The Psychological Rehabilitation of Alcoholics. It looks like that. That is the statement that was rewritten from the Lancet Journal article, supposed to be published in this book. That too was a little too complicated. And if you read it, you'll see why. So what we're about to read, which presents itself as the doctor's statement, was actually written by Bill Wilson. Bill took what you have here in the copy I sent you, and you'll see that there are one or two parts in this he took exactly from it. Most of it he didn't. He paraphrased. But you'll see even the parts that he took directly from here are a little bit hairy. But that's what we're going to start with next week. We're going to start with that Lancet Journal article, and we're going to talk about how it was dumbed down in a way for the book, and then dumbed down even further for the actual publication in the book. And that's what we're about to do, is to read that version where he says, the doctor writes, and we're going to continue from there. We have a few minutes. We have about 15 minutes. If there are any questions, any thoughts, this is the time. I think Michael had his hand up first. Go ahead, Mike.
Hi, Howard. Thank you so much for today. If I'm not mistaken, I just have an observation of interest. I believe Dr. Silkworth's letter was written on his 65th birthday, July 27th, 1938.
Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? Wow. Coincidence.
13 years later at 78.
Yeah, the things you notice. We're gonna notice something like that when we get to Bill's story, when we talk about the tombstone that he came across. There's a date on that tombstone that is very significant in AA history, and I've never heard it discussed at a meeting. So thank you for bringing that up, because now I'll bring it up at the meeting as well. Thank you. James.
Well, Howard, you read something at the very, very beginning of the doctor's opinion. That wasn't in the handouts, was it?
Yes, it was. It was called The Doctor Who Loved Drunks. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I didn't see that.
Looks like
I
that.
didn't get it either.
Yeah, I didn't get that one.
Okay. Just drop me an email at thebigbookstudy@aol.com, and I'll be